Hi, it's Alison from the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox. Today we're talking about one of the stressful decisions facing law students, which is whether you should take the UBE exam as soon as possible or wait for the NextGen. All right, well, whether you take the NextGen or the UBE is not actually a theoretical question pretty quickly. Lee, what is happening in terms of timing on this?
I tell you, it feels like it's getting really close.
It is getting very close.
Like we used to talk about this. It's like, 5 years from now, like 3 years from now. Now it's like 1 year from now. So this is no longer like not happening or happening way out in the future. It is happening. And depending on when you graduate and which jurisdiction you are trying to get licensed in, you may have options. But the first bundle of jurisdictions are taking the NextGen bar exam in July 2026, which is not that far away. It is less than a year away.
Less than a year. I mean, so there's only one final exam where all the UBE people will be taking it together. That'll be February 2026. So if you are an attorney applicant and you're not graduating from law school, that would be your last opportunity to only take the UBE across the country. So after that, there are going to be some NextGen options. So you can choose.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the first bundle is going to take the July 2026, and that is Connecticut, Guam, Idaho, Maryland, Missouri, Northern Mariana Islands, Oregon, Palau, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Washington. I think the larger jurisdictions on that list are really Oregon and Washington, especially since so many attorneys who go, or I guess so many law students who go to law school in Oregon and Washington are going to stay and take those bars. So that's kind of a concentrated kind of group of applicants. But there are some big jurisdictions in there. So a lot of folks are going to be taking the NextGen in July 2026.
Right, potentially. I mean, one of the things we're really waiting to hear on, which we'll talk about later, is this kind of cross-portability of scores between the NextGen and the UBE. I mean, theoretically, that could be happening. But if you are graduating in May 2026 and you want to practice in one of these jurisdictions, you could potentially, maybe even probably, be taking the NextGen exam. For everybody else, this is going to happen in waves. You've got 13 jurisdictions coming on board in July 2027, 3 in February 2028, 18 in July 2028. And that is the drop dead date beyond which they cannot give the standard UBE. So by July 2028, everyone who is in a UBE state is going to be taking the NextGen exam.
And for those who don't get media blasts from the NCBE like we do, it's been amazing to listen to them roll out this because they frame it as, shockingly enough, this jurisdiction is going to use the NextGen starting in July 2028. And they have no choice. There will be no other bars.
We're so excited to announce that they are going to be waiting until the last possible second.
I know. Everyone's on
funny.
board.
Yeah.
It's so funny.
I mean, the reality is, they're not going to give the multiple choice questions. And so there are, still some open questions around really big states like California, Florida, who do rely on the MBE. Are they eventually going to come on board for the NextGen? That remains to be seen, but we are eagerly awaiting that answer.
Yes. Especially because California has shown that it is not competent to write its own new bar exam.
Yeah. So there's going to be a lot of kind of uncertainty and flexibility in some ways over the next few years. I mean, the working assumption is that if you take either exam and get a high enough score, you will be able to be admitted in your jurisdiction. So, even if Oregon starts it in 2026, we still think they're going to take UBE scores for a while. We don't know that. So that's one of the big open questions. But assuming that is the case, people may be able to choose between one exam or the other. So we wanted to talk today about some things you might want to consider when you're making this choice.
Yeah. So we've got some other great episodes about what the NextGen looks like. And I think step one is you should learn what it looks like,
right?
Because I think that's really going to inform your decision. But one of the big differences is, in theory, of course, we're still learning more about this test. You're not supposed to have to memorize as much law.
Yeah.
So if you're someone who has rocked memorization in law school, you were just killing those issue spotters, that was really your strength, then the typical UBE, the what are we calling it?
Legacy.
The legacy UBE may be the right answer for you because your law school training may have led you to do well on that exam.
Right. Yeah. If you're somebody who has basically a photographic memory, this, the normal UBE is probably playing to your strengths. If you're somebody who can just cram information in your head and go and apply it, this is probably the exam for you. I mean, to some extent, I think somebody who's traditionally been like a great standardized test taker, frankly, it probably doesn't matter. Those skills transfer across the type of exam. If you've done really well on the SAT, the LSAT, the GRE, you can probably figure out either exam. But if memorization particularly is like a really strong suit for you, I think that you are probably going to be closer to the top of the curve on the UBE just by virtue of that.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's interesting when you're talking to other folks that maybe have graduated from law school. Some bar takers sat for the practice test just to give the NCB data. They might have all sorts of feedback as well. It's important to remember they never got their scores.
Right.
I don't know if anyone has ever had an experience where they thought they rocked a test and then didn't pass. But make sure that when you're getting feedback about how easy this test is, I think it's important to recognize that anyone who has done one of these, experimental offerings of the test didn't get their scores.
Yeah. All right. So some other people who we think should probably maybe consider sticking for the moment with the legacy UBE is a retaker. If you've already taken the UBE and you didn't pass, at least you studied for it. You've understand the format, you've had that experience, you may have leftover study materials, and you kind of maybe know what went wrong. So unless there's a really serious reason, which we'll get to later, about why you might want to take the new test, I think you just stick with what you know for the time being and try to get it done. What do you think, Lee?
I think so, especially because your law school curriculum is also geared to this test.
Yeah.
And so that is something that will help you even if you have struggled with the test. You still have that foundation. Your law school was not designed to prep you for the NextGen. Maybe they will be in the future, but not at this moment.
Right.
And so,
yeah.
If you don't have that foundation.
Yeah, if you've already graduated, you're not going to be able to go back and, get the skills that they're looking for because this is more of a skills-based situation. And some people might say, oh, well, I'm a practicing attorney. Like, I think that'll help. Maybe it will. But I think it could be a little like the performance test, which practicing attorneys often think, oh, well, I'm a lawyer. I don't need to prepare for this specific thing. But this is an artificial construct. When they're testing client counseling skills, it's not, can you sit down and counsel a client? It's looking for very specific types of things. So, I know, maybe the real world skills come into play and maybe they're just looking for something specific.
Yeah. The problem is we don't have a lot of information. Right. So we're all still...
Therein lies the rub. We're not really sure.
Yeah. I'm also, thinking for foreign trained attorneys that this test is also going to feel very different. I would probably recommend that a foreign trained attorney take the more traditional exam only because we know more about how to prep for it. There is more law tested, but the amount of reading on this NextGen is pretty significant. And I think some folks for whom English is not their first language may find it very intimidating. And even understanding what some of these questions are asking, I myself had to kind of sit and be like, what do they want here?
Yeah.
And again, if you got an LLM and nobody was preparing you to take exams like this, I think the legacy UBE may feel a bit more familiar, even though LLM student programs do not do a great job of preparing, graduates for the bar exam.
Yeah. Ultimately, in the long run, maybe it becomes easier if you're a foreign trained attorney to have less material to memorize. Totally. We're both having this conversation a lot with people like, well, what should I do? The reality is most lawyers and law students and people taking the bar are probably somewhat risk averse. And so I'm hearing from a lot of people that they don't necessarily want to be in that very first batch of students taking the test just because we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, we saw that in February 2025 in California. That was a total guinea pig situation. It was a total disaster. I don't anticipate that this will be like that, but it is not, the NextGen is not a known entity. Whereas the UBE, we have decades of data on pass rates, study strategies, what to expect, how it's going to work.
Practice questions.
Questions. Like one thing that comes up sometimes, the next year is going to be completely on the computer. So you're not going to have scratch paper. This happened in the COVID era where suddenly people had to do everything on the computer. We have episodes talking about how to make that transition from back in that time. But, the reality is it is different. So if you're somebody who has some anxiety around things, who doesn't really like change, which probably describes most lawyers, there's something to be said for just taking the exam, the devil versus the devil you don't, and just getting it done.
Yeah. I also think there's a lot of unknowns around the time management piece of this test because we do not have a lot of examples. So if you have really struggled with timing or managing your own time within a test-taking scenario, the traditional legacy UBE is very clean in that regard. It's like every 30 minutes you need to move on to another question. Every 90 minutes you are done with a performance test. You have a 3-hour set of multiple choice, and then another 3-hour set. You can come up with strategies to manage and create scaffolding so you don't lose track of time and that you need to keep moving on to other questions. Because these integrated question sets and even a little of the performance tests that we've seen are not so structured, we can't, as bar providers, tell you that we know what the test is going to look like. Nobody knows. And if your bar review provider is telling you that they know, they don't know either.
No.
We're all making educated guesses. And it's going to be much more challenging because I can't say, well, on your integrated question set of 24 minutes, you should spend, 10 minutes reading the facts and then like 5 minutes on question 1 and 4 minutes on question 2. I'm not going to do the math to get to 24. But the idea is it's not going to be as repetitive and structured. And I think that's going to be a challenge for some students.
Yeah, I feel like, particularly, ADHD time blindness is one of the things. So you just literally can't track time in a way. And it just gets away from people. We just don't know what these are going to look like. Like the 2 released integrated question sets. One has a series of questions and there's a whole variety. The other one is literally, as I recall, some information and then say 5 things that would be wrong with this. And that's the whole question.
Yeah, it's like a pleading. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that's it. That's what you've got 24 minutes to come up with 5 things to write down. It's pretty weird.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really abstract feeling for a lot of law students, especially those who have not been taking these types of tests in your law school career.
Right. Well, the other thing is they're going to be kind of piecemeal. So a 3-hour section is going to have one of each of the pieces. So... or even I think they're doing 2 integrated question sets and a 3-hour section. So it's going to be a lot of back and forth. And if you're spiraling on that 5 questions for writing down for an hour, that could be a big problem.
Yeah. And I think it's hard as providers because we are not getting a lot of examples is that, I feel very confident telling someone how to manage their time or even their extended time if they get accommodations on a traditional legacy UBE.
Yeah.
And we're all making educated guesses on the NextGen. And I would say, even if you're getting feedback from folks who, took those practice exams, remember they typically took them after they did a full prep for the UBE. So they did not memorize less law. They didn't prep for this unique test where we're getting messaging you don't need to know as much substantive law. You didn't need to know this. So, and again, we don't know if those people even passed. So that's, so there's still a lot of open questions. And if you are someone who really struggles with time and needs very strict guidelines, I think the opportunity to take the legacy UBE is probably one you want to take.
Right. And, I hear from some people who are like, I just can't finish any piece of it. And it's like, okay, well, if you're telling me you don't finish half the test, like
that's a problem.
That's a problem. You're probably still going to have that problem. If it was something very, very extreme like that, I might say like, okay, you maybe should consider waiting. Just because it is probably going to be less time pressured, but I don't think it's going to solve that problem necessarily.
No.
The other type of timing problem is, if you have a job offer that's contingent on you passing by a certain date, obviously a lot of people have financial issues because they're not able to work as a practicing attorney until they pass this exam. I would say just get the UBE done at that point. Like, this is a more predictable timeline. You know what you need to do. And it's just going to get you, closer to that end goal of being licensed as soon as possible.
Yeah. All right. What about students and bar takers who would benefit from waiting for the NextGen?
I do think there are, arguments to be made that this will be an easier test for certain people. Like, if you're very practical, if you're very skills oriented, if you've done a lot either in your career or in law school about clinics, externships, practical legal writing, the NextGen is probably going to play more to your strengths. The emphasis is on these skills of client counseling, research, real world application. I think there are definitely students who think more like practicing attorneys, and they've often been really frustrated with the bar exam and to some extent with like substantive law school classes. I think these people could thrive on the NextGen.
Yeah. And we all had those friends in law school
who
just didn't really excel academically, but they are amazing practicing attorneys.
Yeah.
They're good at the practical skills part. That's really where they thrive. They did not thrive in those traditional testing environments.
Yeah. So I think if that is you, lean into that. Obviously, you're still going to have to study the material, but you're probably going to have a leg up in terms of, well, I've had this experience of a client asking me something similar to this, so I know what I would tell them. That's pretty easy to write down.
Mm-hmm. I think folks who really struggle with memorization is another group of students who might find the NextGen to be a bit friendlier. We often hear from career change students, who have had a career and then they go back to law school kind of to do a career change, that it's hard to memorize volumes of information because they're very out of practice. And so law school is challenging in that way. They might prefer a bar exam that is not going to be so memorization heavy. Again, it's a little unclear what that means, but it should be like not as memorization heavy. So I think that some takers may find that a relief.
Right. I would say on the scale of, 1 to 100, 100 being the legacy UB, the memorization, I'm guessing, is probably somewhere at like 60 to 70% of that, but that's still less than 100.
Yeah, that's true. So I think especially if you didn't take all of those bar classes in law school,
right.
And sometimes career change students especially go to law school with a very clear focus. They want to do child advocacy work, and so they take all of their electives to feed into that, so they don't take all of those bar classes. They may really prefer a test that doesn't require so much memorization of subjects that they have no interest in learning at all.
Right. If you are looking at this, scope of the legacy UB and saying, I haven't taken 5 of these classes, that's going to be a lot to learn and get up to speed on. And just frankly, frustrating and probably a waste of your time, which doesn't really make it easy for people to sit down and learn that material.
Yeah. And then what about, students who are targeting early adopter jurisdictions? You want to practice in Washington and Oregon or Connecticut. You're graduating in the summer or the spring of 2026. This is your test.
Yeah. This is where things are going to probably get a little complicated. If you're in one of these early adopting jurisdictions and you don't have any other reason not to, I would say you probably should plan to take the NextGen. That if you get a high enough score, you'll be admitted in the state. Great. That's what you need. That's what you need. Because this portability and reciprocity puzzle seems like it could get a little complicated. I mean, one of the UBE's biggest advantages has been portability. You know, you pass it, you get a score, your score is a 310. You're like, great, I can use that score for the next X number of years in any state I want to be in. Very clean, very simple. Question, of course, is what happens to that system when some jurisdictions are using the NextGen and others still use the UBE? I mean, there also could be these edge cases like Hawaii, which uses the UBE, but it has a Hawaii-specific component. And we've heard kind of more and more rumblings of states that might want to use that extra afternoon to have their own state-specific portion of the exam, which would impact this sort of portability. So, I mean, the answer is we don't know. But I think if you were considering this question, this is something you want to be very clear on before you make a decision.
I also thought it was interesting that they're just totally changing the scoring as well.
Right, yeah.
You know, we all know what these UBE numbers mean. And now we're talking about numbers between 500 and 750. Like, what does that mean? Like, where are the cutoffs going to be?
So it's like credit score?
I know, it does feel like a credit score. You're right. I was like, why do these numbers sound familiar? They do sound like a credit score. You don't want a 500. It's the same, I guess. But I do think it's something folks really have to keep in mind, especially because forum shopping for a friendly legacy UBE jurisdiction was something that we were seeing more and more of. You know, if you wanted to do federal work and you were struggling with the UBE, sometimes you would go to a jurisdiction where you just needed to be licensed somewhere and go to a very friendly jurisdiction with a 260 cutoff, and maybe you can get licensed in that jurisdiction. I think that was happening more and more. And this is going to make that a bit more complicated. So again, if you were considering forum shopping, you really need to be educated about what you're doing before you make assumptions.
Yeah, because I think there's still a lot of like wishy-washiness in what the NCBE has been saying around portability. I haven't read the exact language recently, but as I recall, it was something along the lines of like, we hope that, or we expect that, these scores will be portable. They did not actually say you will be able to sit in one place with one type of exam, definitely transfer it to another, and here is what that will look like. That just hasn't been done yet. And, like we said, we're getting kind of down to the wire here. So it would be really great if, I don't think I certainly haven't seen any NextGen state like say what their score cutoff is going to be. Have you?
No, it's all in ranges, and I don't even know what those score cutoffs mean, to be honest, because we haven't seen enough. Well, we haven't seen any scores. That's part of the problem. And then you've got big jurisdictions like New York who, have a pretty tough pass rate, not like California. They're not going to be welcoming in a whole new crop of lawyers. They're still going to want to be typically nobody wants to just welcome everyone in. Everybody wants this to be some sort of a gatekeeper, because the more senior lawyers who took these challenging exams are not quick to say that, everyone should get in a different way.
Yeah.
So
it's
there's
a
going
cartel,
to be,
let's be honest.
but there's going to be pressure not to just say like, oh, well, then everyone can get licensed in New York before New York changes the test. I mean, I'm not a member of the New York bar. I'm not seeing these communications. I can only guess that there will be a lot of discussions about that, and it's not going to be particularly simple.
Right. I mean, my assumption, if I'm speculating here, and this is speculation, do not rely on this to make any life choices, but my speculation is if a state has already said like, okay, our pass score for the UBE is a 266 or 270. I mean, it seems like they would just keep that until the end of the process, until July 2028, and like let you come in if you have that score. But again, that's total speculation.
Yeah, and then the question would be, well, what if you got the equivalent of that in the NextGen, whatever that might be, and how do they even know what that is?
Right, well, I think that's the trickier piece. Is like, every state already has a pass score for the UBEs, the regular UBEs. So like, okay, we'll just probably keep those. The bigger question is, okay, so Oregon and Washington and these other states like do this in July, they set their pass score, but like, are all the other states going to have to pick a pass score at that point that they're going to let in from these other places? Like, these are all very open questions, and it feels to me like it is getting late in the day for this to still be an open question.
Yeah, and the other thing is states are still responsible for grading these tests themselves, which I feel like is often like dusted under the rug. And so the states themselves still have a lot of control over how they grade this test, who they let in, how they score it. And I would not be super excited to be running a committee of bar examiners in a state where there's a lot of ambiguity, because you're going to also have to train new graders and make sure that there's consistency in scoring. I know that the NCBE is going to give, score sheets and grids and all these recommendations, but there is going to be a transition time where I'm going to guess a lot of things are not clear, which is why if you're taking this test, you need to really think about where you want your license and try to sit in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like we said, that's the safest bet. You know that you want to be practicing in Oregon, you take the NextGen in Oregon, you pass, you're good. I think it's harder when people aren't sure, or sometimes people have these hypothetical ideas about what they might want to be doing in the future, but like really focus on, okay, where is my job? Where do I want to live? And like get that one taken care of first, I feel like is probably the best option.
Yeah. Well, in the last couple minutes that we have, do we want to talk about some scenarios? We've been talking to students about these choices recently. So let's talk about a student, let's call her Sarah, who's a 2L. She goes to law school in New York. She wants to practice corporate law in Manhattan. New York is not the first wave of NextGen adopters, so she's going to have a choice to, sit in New York and take the legacy UBE, or travel to a different state to take the NextGen, or to wait for New York's NextGen rollout. So what should Sarah do? She's been a strong memorizer, but struggled with practical skills courses in her law school career.
Sarah should take the UBE, probably in New York.
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible, right, to give her more options. I mean, the other thing to think about is if you don't pass the first time, you want to have the option to take the same test again as long as possible. She gets to play to her strengths, which are memorization. She's sitting in the state she wants to be in. She avoids the uncertainty, being in one of these first waves. Her goal is to be licensed as quickly as possible. So she should not think twice about this. She should sit in New York, take the UBE, and get her license ASAP.
Yeah. All right, but what about Mike, who's a 3L graduating this spring? He wants to practice in Washington. We know that Washington is one of those jurisdictions that's going to start using the NextGen in July 2026. Mike has a lot of experience working in law clinics, did well in legal writing, and has done some work in client services. But even if that wasn't true, he wants to practice in Washington. So what does Mike do?
Mike takes the NextGen in Washington. He is likely to do well on those skill-based components. It's going to be less for him to have to sit down and memorize. He's got strong practical skills. The new format might actually give him an advantage over the traditional UBE format. So again, Mike should just make that decision and not look back.
Yeah. And talk to his law school about what they're going to do to help make sure that he's ready.
Absolutely. And to his bar prep class or bar prep company to make sure they have practice materials, because that is an open question. Yeah. But even then, Mike should just get it done.
Get it done. And then we've talked a little bit about retakers, but let's say Jessica is a retaker who failed the July 2025 UBE. The target jurisdiction that she is studying for is going to adopt the NextGen in February 2027. So not the first administration, the second administration. She could retake the UBE in February 2026 or wait for the NextGen. What should this person do?
I mean, generally speaking, I would advise her to go ahead and just take the UBE and get that done. We can evaluate what went wrong on that exam. We have her score sheet, if not her essays. She's got study material. She understands the format. I mean, generally speaking, I would say do not switch horses in midstream to this new exam. Try to work with what you've already done. And then if that also doesn't go well the second time around, then maybe reevaluate. But I would say for the first retake, I would do the UBE. Do you agree?
Yeah. Sounds great. Well, we're almost out of time. Any final thoughts for nervous law students who are trying to navigate this, ever-changing landscape?
I mean, I do think it's a challenge. I think there's a lot of like chatter out there about like, is the next gen easier, that kind of thing. I just think the bottom line is you've got to look at your personal situation and really evaluate in the state that I'm looking at, what is the time frame, and what are my options, and what are they doing around portability of scores. And once you clarify those things, I think it'll be pretty obvious to most people what they should do. And you're always welcome to reach out. We actually like chatting with people about things like this, so reach out and we will help you figure out what to do.
Yeah. I think this is one of those situations where you can go down the rabbit hole, like the Reddit rabbit hole.
Yeah, big time.
Where a lot of folks will speak with a lot of authority on stuff that there's still just a lot of open questions about. So if you're nervous, I think speaking to trusted experts, utilizing your resources at your law school are much better options for getting answers and making thoughtful decisions. Just put the Reddit down. I know it's hard. It's easy to dive in, but just step away.
And the reality is people are going to pass both tests. It's probably going to be about the same percentage of people in the States. If you're somebody who's always done fine on standardized tests, I just really don't think you need to worry. Like, you'll do fine on either one of them probably. And then I think there are people who are more of these edge cases where there may be real pros or cons to going one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, with that, I think we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like, leave us a comment, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. Of course, you can check out barexamtoolbox.com, where we will be sharing all of our thoughts on the next gen as this rollout continues.